Sometimes the smallest act of honesty opens the oldest wound fate has been waiting to uncover. Claire Dawson had missed flights before, missed birthdays too, even missed chances she never admitted she wanted. But she had never imagined that returning something she found beneath an airport seat would quietly pull her into the orbit of a man whose silence carried more weight than most people's promises. The necklace rested in the center of her palm as she crossed Terminal B of JFK Airport, its silver chain catching strips of pale morning sunlight that slipped through towering windows overlooking the runways. It wasn't flashy, no oversized diamonds. Just an elegant antique gemstones, shaped like a small compass rose, worn smooth by years of careful hands. Someone had loved it enough to carry it everywhere. That much was obvious. Claire slowed beside the airport information desk, intending to hand it over until she noticed a cluster of black SUVs stopping outside the glass entrance. Travelers barely looked up, assuming another celebrity or business executive had arrived. Airport employees, however, exchanged quick glances before quietly stepping aside. Whatever was happening, everyone suddenly seemed careful not to stand in the wrong place. Claire looked back at the necklace. A tiny engraving on the clasp caught her eye. DF. Those initials meant nothing to her, yet something about the craftsmanship made her hesitate. Unfortunately for her, less than 100 feet away, 3 men were searching every inch of the departure lounge for that exact necklace. Damien Ferraro entered without raising his voice or rushing his pace. His charcoal overcoat fit with effortless precision despite the cold January wind following him through the automatic doors. He carried no visible display of authority, yet conversation softened as he passed. His security team spread naturally through the terminal, blending into the moving crowd instead of disturbing it. Claire never noticed him. She was explaining to the customer service representative where she had found the necklace when another employee hurried over, holding a radio pressed tightly against his ear. "Ma'am, would you mind waiting just one moment?" the employee asked politely. "Someone may already be looking for it." Claire smiled. "Of course. I'd hate for someone to lose something this personal." Her answer was simple, honest, exactly the kind of answer nobody around Damien Ferraro expected anymore. At that exact moment, Damien turned toward the counter. His eyes settled on the necklace first. Relief flashed across his face so briefly that almost no one noticed. Then Claire turned around. Time stopped. At least, it seemed to stop for everyone watching him. Damien didn't move. He didn't blink. His expression remained perfectly composed, yet every member of his security detail instinctively stiffened. They had seen him negotiate impossible business deals without hesitation. They had watched him face politicians, billionaires, and rivals with the same calm certainty. None of them had ever seen him forget to breathe. Claire frowned politely, assuming she had accidentally blocked his path. "I'm sorry," she said. "Is this yours?" Damien didn't answer immediately. His eyes never left her face. Not the necklace, her face. The terminal announcements faded beneath the distant roar of another departing aircraft. Rolling suitcases continued across polished floors. Families hurried toward boarding gates. The world kept moving while one impossible memory refused to stay buried. Claire had never met this man. She would have remembered someone like him, yet the way he looked at her felt strangely familiar, as though she had unknowingly stepped into the final page of someone else's unfinished story. "Sir?" the airport employee asked carefully. Damien reached for the necklace with remarkable restraint, taking it gently instead of snatching it away. His fingertips lingered against the cold silver before he looked back at Claire. "Where did you get this?" His voice remained calm, almost quiet, but every word carried unusual weight. "I found it under a seat near Gate 14, Claire answered. "I figured someone would come looking for it." He nodded once. "Thank you. That should have been the end of it." A polite exchange between strangers inside one of the busiest airports in America. Claire certainly believed it was. She even smiled awkwardly before adjusting the strap of her worn leather bag and preparing to leave for the subway. What she didn't know was that Damien wasn't watching her walk away because of the necklace. He was watching because 24 years earlier, another woman with the same eyes, the same quiet kindness, and the same unmistakable smile had disappeared, carrying that very pendant into the middle of a snowstorm, and according to every record that existed, she had never been seen again. As Claire disappeared into the morning crowd, Damien closed his hand around the necklace and spoke only 4 words to the man standing beside him. "Find out everything immediately." Claire Dawson left the terminal believing the unusual encounter would become nothing more than another strange memory collected during years of commuting through New York City. The cold January air greeted her as she climbed the subway stairs outside the airport, carrying the familiar scent of snow, jet fuel, and roasted coffee drifting from a nearby cart. She adjusted the scarf around her neck and checked the time on her phone. She still had enough time to reach Queens before her afternoon shift at the Community Arts Center. Life, she reminded herself, always moved forward. Behind the glass walls of the terminal, Damien Ferraro remained exactly where she had left him. The silver necklace rested inside his closed hand, while every conversation around him seemed to fade into distant echoes. One member of his security team approached carefully without breaking the silence. "Sir?" Damien finally looked away from the revolving doors where Claire had disappeared into the crowd. Who was she? The question was calm, almost conversational, yet nobody mistook it for casual curiosity. Within seconds, another man quietly opened a tablet containing airport security access requests already moving through private channels. Damien did not ask for favors often, but when he did, people rarely delayed. "No unnecessary attention," he said. "I want facts, not assumptions." His voice never rose, it never needed to. Less than 30 minutes later, Claire boarded the subway without realizing that somewhere above the tunnels, security footage from 3 different airport cameras was already being reviewed frame by frame. The footage confirmed only what Damien had seen with his own eyes. The young woman had found the necklace by accident. She had made no attempt to keep it. She had not searched for its value online. She had not photographed it. She had simply tried to return it. Unfortunately for Claire, that simple act made her impossible to ignore. She spent the train ride reading lesson plans for an after-school art workshop, occasionally looking out the window whenever the train crossed into daylight. Children would be painting winter landscapes that afternoon. She smiled faintly while imagining how every child would insist the sky needed more blue than reality ever allowed. It was a peaceful thought, one she desperately needed after months of juggling 2 jobs and helping her grandmother with medical appointments every weekend. She had learned long ago that ordinary routines could become quiet victories. Across the city, Damien entered his office overlooking the East River. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected grey clouds gathering over Manhattan, while shelves filled with rare books softened the sharp lines of the modern room. Nothing about the office suggested the stories whispered about the man who occupied it. No oversized displays of wealth, no unnecessary decorations, only order, precision, control. An older man entered carrying a slim folder. "The preliminary report," he said. Damien accepted it without speaking. Claire, 27 years old, raised in Connecticut until college before moving to New York, works at a non-profit arts program, no criminal record, no financial irregularities, lives alone, volunteers twice a month at a neighborhood food pantry. Every detail painted the portrait of someone painfully ordinary, yet one line refused to leave Damien's attention. Mother deceased 12 years earlier following a car accident. Damien read the sentence twice before closing the folder. His fingers tightened slightly around the necklace, still resting beside it. At that exact moment, Claire unlocked the side entrance of the community center, where laughter already echoed through brightly painted hallways. Children rushed toward her, carrying sketchbooks and half-finished drawings from the previous week. Their excitement replaced every lingering thought about the airport. For nearly 2 hours, she lost herself explaining color, perspective, and imagination, while snowflakes slowly began falling outside the classroom windows. One little girl held up a drawing of a compass surrounded by flowers. Claire laughed softly. "That is beautiful," she said. "It looks like it knows exactly where it belongs." The child grinned proudly before running back to her seat. Claire never noticed how the image unsettled her for reasons she could not explain. Miles away, Damien opened a small wooden box stored inside his office safe. Resting within black velvet lay an old faded photograph taken more than 2 decades earlier. A young woman smiled into the camera while wearing the very same necklace. Her features were different from Claire's in countless small ways, yet one impossible similarity remained: the eyes, the expression, the quiet warmth that seemed untouched by fear or ambition. Damien placed the recovered necklace beside the photograph. For the first time in 24 years, 2 pieces of a story that had never made sense occupied the same table. He stared at them without moving until the office phone rang. His assistant spoke only one sentence. "Sir, there is something unusual in the airport surveillance that you should see." Damien slowly lifted his eyes toward the darkening skyline, unaware that the answer he had chased for half his life was already moving toward him without knowing she carried it. Snow continued drifting across Queens long after the children had gone home. covering sidewalks and parked cars beneath a quiet white blanket that made the city seem softer than it really was. Claire Dawson locked the classroom door, switched off the lights one by one, and stepped into the empty hallway carrying a canvas tote filled with paintbrushes that still smelled faintly of watercolor and pine cleaner. Her phone vibrated as she reached the front entrance. It was her grandmother reminding her not to forget Sunday dinner. Claire smiled while promising she would bring dessert this time instead of flowers. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but it grounded her in the familiar rhythm of ordinary life. She had no reason to believe anyone outside her small circle even knew her name. Several miles away, Damien Ferraro watched silent security footage projected across a wall-sized display inside a private conference room. The airport recording showed Claire discovering the necklace beneath a row of empty seats before looking around for its owner. She never slipped it into her pocket. She never hesitated. She immediately walked toward the information desk. The footage continued from another camera angle. Damien studied every movement with unusual patience. Then the technician froze a single frame. Claire had paused beside a large terminal window just long enough for sunlight to illuminate the left side of her face. Damien stood without saying a word. The resemblance was not exact. It was something far more unsettling, a gesture, the angle of her smile, the way she instinctively tucked loose hair behind one ear. Memories rarely returned all at once. They arrived in fragments, each one carrying more weight than the last. 24 years earlier, another winter morning had begun with the same pale sunlight reflecting off fresh snow. Damien closed his eyes briefly before opening them again. He refused to let memory become evidence. Facts mattered more than emotion. Continue, he instructed quietly, until Claire disappeared through the airport exit. That is everything, he said. Damien nodded once. No contact. The room fell silent. One of his senior advisors looked surprised. Sir? Damien kept watching the empty screen. She returned what was not hers. She deserves privacy until we know whether any of this means anything. His answer settled the discussion. Nobody questioned him again. Across the river, Claire stopped at a neighborhood grocery store to pick up soup, fresh bread, and oranges before walking the remaining 6 blocks to her apartment building. The lobby smelled like old radiator heat and someone's homemade tomato sauce drifting beneath apartment doors. She greeted Mr. Alvarez from the 2nd floor while helping him carry 2 heavy grocery bags upstairs. He thanked her with the same joke he repeated every week, insisting she was too young to have the patience of someone twice her age. Claire laughed because she genuinely enjoyed hearing it. Kindness had always felt easier than rushing past people. Later that evening, she settled onto the worn sofa beside her living room window while snow collected against the fire escape outside. She opened an old wooden keepsake box, searching for stationery to write her grandmother a birthday card. Instead, she found a faded photograph tucked beneath several unopened postcards. The picture showed her mother standing beside a small lake many years before the accident that had taken her life. Claire traced the edge of the photograph with one fingertip. Something caught her attention almost immediately. Around her mother's neck hung a delicate chain. The image had faded too much to reveal the pendant clearly, but for one strange moment Claire thought the outline looked familiar. She leaned closer, trying to sharpen details that time had already stolen. The phone rang before she could study it longer. A co-worker needed someone to cover Saturday morning because her son had the flu. Claire agreed without hesitation, placed the photograph back inside the box, and forgot about the necklace-shaped silhouette almost as quickly as she had noticed it. Unfortunately for her, the answer hidden inside that photograph had already begun changing the course of several lives. Near midnight, Damien remained alone inside his office after everyone else had gone home. The city lights reflected across the East River like scattered stars, while the recovered necklace rested beside the old photograph inside the wooden box he had guarded for decades. He reached beneath the photograph and unfolded a yellowed newspaper clipping that had rarely left its protective sleeve. The headline reported a highway accident during a severe snowstorm 24 years earlier. No survivors had ever been identified with certainty because records from the scene had remained incomplete. Damien looked from the clipping to Claire's file resting beside it. One date quietly demanded his attention. Claire had entered the foster care system less than 3 weeks after the accident described in the article. It could have been coincidence, nothing more. Yet coincidence had begun arriving too often. He carefully closed the folder before speaking into the quiet room. Find the hospital records from that winter. Outside his office, snow continued falling across New York, covering streets, rooftops, and forgotten footprints alike. While neither Claire nor Damien realized that the first verified piece of the truth had finally surfaced beneath decades of silence, Saturday morning arrived wrapped in fresh snow and pale winter sunlight, transforming Queens into a city that looked quieter than it truly was. Claire Dawson unlocked the Community Arts Center before anyone else arrived, balancing a cardboard tray of hot chocolate on one arm while searching her coat pocket for the building keys. The silence felt comforting. She enjoyed these few peaceful minutes before children's laughter filled every hallway. The familiar scent of tempera paint, old wood floors, and fresh coffee greeted her as she switched on the lights one room at a time. Outside, passing buses left narrow tracks through the snow while parents hurried children toward weekend activities. It looked like every other ordinary morning. Unfortunately for Claire, somewhere across the East River, several pieces of a forgotten history were beginning to fit together with unsettling precision. Damien Ferraro stood inside a climate-controlled records room beneath one of his family's office buildings. Shelves filled with carefully preserved files stretched across the dimly lit space, interrupted only by a large oak table where folders from hospitals, newspapers, and public archives had gradually formed a growing timeline. He rarely visited this room himself. Today felt different. An older archivist carefully placed another sealed envelope on the table. "This came from the State Records Office," he explained quietly. "It took some convincing." Damien nodded without looking away from the documents already spread before him. Inside the envelope rested photocopies from a pediatric hospital dated 24 years earlier. Most of the pages contained ordinary intake forms and handwritten medical observations faded by time. Then one page stopped him completely. An unidentified little girl, estimated age 3, found alive after the winter highway accident. Temporary guardian assigned until extended family could be located. Damien read the page twice before setting it down. The child's name had never been recorded because nobody knew it. The final note simply stated that the child had later entered State Protective Services, following unsuccessful attempts to identify surviving relatives. Damien remained silent. He knew better than to mistake possibility for certainty. Yet another coincidence had quietly aligned with every clue collected during the past 2 days. Less than a mile away, Claire helped children decorate cardboard snowflakes while cheerful music drifted from an old speaker balanced near the classroom window. One little boy accidentally spilled blue paint across the table and immediately looked ready to cry. Claire simply smiled, handed him a clean towel, and showed him how mistakes sometimes became the most interesting part of a painting. Within minutes, the spilled paint had transformed into a bright winter river flowing beneath paper mountains. The children applauded as if they had witnessed magic. Claire laughed with them, never realizing that her ability to bring calm wherever she went resembled someone Damien had spent decades trying not to forget. Shortly after noon, Claire stepped outside carrying 2 large bags of donated art supplies toward a storage shed behind the building. A cold breeze lifted loose strands of hair across her face while church bells echoed somewhere beyond the neighboring streets. As she reached for the shed door, an elderly volunteer named Mrs. Henderson paused beside her, holding a steaming cup of tea. "You remind me so much of your mother," the older woman said gently. Claire smiled. "People tell me that sometimes." Mrs. Henderson studied her for another moment. She wore the same expression whenever she helped someone. Like kindness was never something she had to think about. Claire lowered her eyes politely. She remembered surprisingly little about her mother beyond scattered photographs and bedtime stories that had blurred together over the years. "I wish I remembered more." Mrs. Henderson squeezed her hand before returning inside without another word. The conversation lingered in Claire's thoughts far longer than she expected. At that exact moment, Damien received another report. This one contained no dramatic discoveries. Instead, it listed every verified address connected to Claire's childhood, including one small town in Connecticut where she had briefly lived with foster parents before eventually being adopted. Damien closed the folder and stared through the office windows overlooking the grey winter skyline. "No surveillance," he instructed calmly. "No pressure. If there is truth here, it deserves patience." His advisors exchanged brief glances. That decision surprised them more than any document uncovered so far. Damien had spent most of his adult life solving impossible problems through speed and certainty. This time he deliberately chose restraint. As evening settled across New York, Claire returned home carrying leftover craft supplies and a small paper snowflake one of the children had insisted she keep. She placed it beside the faded photograph of her mother still resting on the coffee table. For reasons she could not explain, she picked up the photograph once more and looked carefully at the tiny silver shape hanging around her mother's neck. The image remained too blurred to identify. Still, an uneasy feeling settled quietly inside her. Not fear, not recognition. Simply the strange sense that something important had been trying to reach her for years. Outside her apartment window, snow began falling again, covering old footprints before anyone could follow where they had once led. While across the city a single hospital record continued waiting inside Damien's office, holding one unanswered detail that neither of them was prepared to face. Monday arrived with clear skies and the kind of crisp winter air that made every sound travel a little farther through the streets of New York. Claire Dawson left her apartment just after 7, carrying a canvas bag filled with lesson plans, library books, and the paper snowflake that one of her students had insisted she keep. The sidewalks still glittered with patches of ice left behind by the weekend storm, and the rising sun reflected from rows of apartment windows until the entire neighborhood seemed wrapped in pale gold. She stopped at the same corner coffee shop she visited every Monday, greeting the barista by name before ordering a small coffee and a plain bagel. Routine had always been her quiet way of keeping life predictable. She had no reason to imagine that somewhere across Manhattan another person had quietly rearranged his own schedule because of a single chance meeting at the airport. Damien Ferraro stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, watching the morning traffic flow across the Queensboro Bridge. The city beneath him looked orderly from a distance, every vehicle moving with purpose, every commuter following familiar patterns. Yet one unanswered question refused to fit into that order. Another folder rested on his desk, thinner than the others. It contained only 3 pages, adoption records, public documents, a single family photograph taken outside a small white house in Connecticut nearly 20 years earlier. Claire smiled at the camera while standing between her adoptive parents, looking no older than 8. Damien studied the image for several quiet moments before placing it back inside the folder. She had grown up surrounded by people who clearly loved her. That fact brought him unexpected relief. Whatever had happened before that photograph, someone had given her a childhood filled with ordinary memories instead of unanswered fear. His assistant entered carrying the day's schedule before pausing when she noticed the untouched stack of business contracts, still waiting for signatures. "Your board meeting begins in 20 minutes, she reminded him gently. Damien nodded without looking away from the photograph. "Reschedule the afternoon," she hesitated. "You have not cancelled an afternoon in almost 3 years. Then today is unusual." His answer ended the conversation. Less than an hour later, Claire arrived at the public library, where the art center hosted a weekly reading program for elementary school children. Colorful paper decorations hung from the ceiling while parents chatted quietly near the entrance. Claire arranged watercolor supplies across several folding tables before helping a nervous little boy choose his first library card. His excitement reminded her why she had never regretted choosing a career that offered purpose instead of wealth. As the morning continued, laughter echoed between tall bookshelves, blending with the soft turning of pages and the occasional announcement from the front desk. Life felt beautifully uncomplicated. Unfortunately for Claire, someone else had begun noticing how often kindness seemed to appear wherever she went. At that exact moment, Damien sat inside a modest neighborhood several blocks from the library. No security surrounded his table, no luxury vehicles waited outside the window. He had chosen the location because it overlooked the small public square where the library entrance remained clearly visible across the street. He had not come to interrupt Claire's day. He had come to answer one simple question that no document could explain. Was the honesty he witnessed at the airport simply coincidence, or was it truly part of who she had become? Nearly 40 minutes passed before he finally saw her through the cafe window. She stepped outside, holding the library door open while helping an elderly man maneuver his walker across the icy sidewalk. Afterward, she knelt to zip a little girl's winter coat before waving goodbye to several children climbing onto a school bus. None of them seemed intimidated by her. Every smile looked natural, every conversation effortless. Damien quietly lowered his coffee cup. There was nothing rehearsed about the way Claire treated people. She expected nothing in return. The realization unsettled him more than any archived record ever had. The woman from his memories had carried herself with that same quiet generosity. He reminded himself again that resemblance was not proof. Memory could deceive even disciplined minds. Claire turned toward the cafe while adjusting the strap of her bag. For a brief second, their eyes met through opposite sides of the glass. Recognition crossed her face almost immediately. Surprise followed. Damien simply inclined his head with polite restraint. Claire hesitated before offering a small, friendly smile, the kind people exchanged with familiar strangers in a city that rarely slowed down. Then she continued walking without another glance. Unaware that she had just answered the question Damien never intended to ask aloud, he watched her disappear around the corner before standing to leave. "Sir," one discreet security officer said after joining him outside, "would you like us to continue monitoring?" Damien looked toward the sidewalk where Claire had vanished into the lunchtime crowd. "No," he replied calmly. "Not monitoring." He paused for only a moment before adding the words that surprised even himself. "Protect her privacy." The officer nodded without asking why. Across the street, Claire never realized that the man she believed to be another passing acquaintance had just made a decision that would quietly shape everything waiting beyond the winter horizon. While deep inside Damien's office, another sealed envelope from the state archives had finally arrived, carrying one forgotten name that neither of them had heard in more than 2 decades. The envelope arrived just before sunrise, resting alone on Damien Ferraro's desk beside the weathered newspaper clipping and the faded photograph that had occupied his thoughts for days. Outside his office windows, Manhattan slowly awakened beneath a clear winter sky, while ferries crossed the East River through ribbons of pale morning mist. Damien opened the newly delivered file with measured patience, refusing to let expectation outrun evidence. Inside rested only a handful of copied documents recovered from an archived social services database. Most of the pages contained routine administrative notes until one handwritten attachment drew his attention. It listed the personal belongings found with the unidentified child rescued after the highway accident 24 years earlier. A small wool blanket, one children's storybook with no ownership mark, a silver hair ribbon, one folded note damaged beyond recognition. The final line made Damien stop reading. "Necklace not recovered at scene." His eyes remained fixed on those 4 words. The necklace had vanished before investigators documented the accident. Yet it had somehow resurfaced decades later beneath an airport seat before finding its way back into his hands through Claire Dawson. He closed the file slowly. Another coincidence had quietly become something much harder to dismiss. Across Queens, Claire wrapped both hands around a warm paper cup while waiting for the morning bus. The icy wind carried the distant sound of traffic along Northern Boulevard, and bundled commuters shifted impatiently as snowmelt trickled towards storm drains beneath the sidewalk. Her thoughts drifted back to the businessman she had unexpectedly recognized outside the neighborhood cafe the previous afternoon. There had been nothing threatening about him. If anything, his calm expression had seemed unexpectedly familiar, although she could not explain why. She shook the thought away as the bus arrived and climbed aboard with the rest of the passengers, choosing her usual seat near the rear window where she could watch neighborhoods gradually change as the city rolled past. The day unfolded much like every other weekday. She spent the morning organizing donated art supplies, helping children finish a mural celebrating winter in New York, and reassuring nervous parents preparing for an upcoming student exhibition. The ordinary rhythm steadied her thoughts until lunchtime, when the center's director approached, carrying a large white envelope with Claire's name written neatly across the front. "Someone dropped this off about an hour ago," the director explained. "There is no return address." Claire accepted it with quiet curiosity. Inside, she discovered a handwritten note on heavy cream-colored stationery. "Thank you for choosing honesty when nobody was watching. Please accept this donation for your students instead of any personal reward." Attached was a certified cashier's check made payable directly to the Community Arts Center, enough to replace aging classroom supplies that staff had struggled to afford for years. No signature appeared beneath the message. Claire read it twice before smiling softly. Whoever had sent it understood exactly what mattered to her. She carried the envelope straight to the director, insisting the money belonged entirely to the children. Less than a mile away, Damien listened as his assistant confirmed that the donation had been accepted exactly as intended. She did not ask who sent it, the assistant reported. She immediately transferred the entire amount to the center's education budget. Damien thanked her quietly before ending the call. He had expected nothing else, yet hearing the confirmation settled something inside him that years of investigation never had. Character revealed itself most clearly when no recognition followed kindness. Unfortunately for Claire, her decision also removed the final doubt remaining in Damien's mind that she deserved to know the truth someday, even if neither of them was ready to face it yet. Late that afternoon, Claire visited her grandmother after work, carrying fresh bread from a neighborhood bakery and helping prepare dinner in the familiar little kitchen filled with the comforting scent of rosemary and vegetable soup. Family photographs covered nearly every wall, preserving birthdays, graduations, and quiet afternoons that had shaped her life. While setting the table, Claire noticed an old storage box tucked beneath a side cabinet. "What is in there?" she asked. Her grandmother smiled thoughtfully. "Mostly things your mother never threw away." Claire knelt beside the box, lifting the lid with gentle care. Inside lay children's drawings, faded greeting cards, and a small leather journal tied with a ribbon that had become brittle with age. Before she could untie it, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. Her grandmother excused herself to answer it, while Claire carefully returned the journal to its place, deciding she would look through everything another day when there was more time. At that exact moment, several miles away, Damien stood alone beside the office window, holding the recovered necklace beneath the fading light of sunset. He remembered the damaged note mentioned in the archive. He remembered the missing necklace. He remembered a frightened winter morning that had never fully released its grip on his life. Then his phone vibrated with a single message from the archivist. The folded note recovered with the child may not have been destroyed after all. We found a reference to a secondary evidence box transferred to another facility 24 years ago. Damien slowly closed his hand around the silver pendant as evening settled across the skyline, realizing that somewhere inside a forgotten storage room another piece of the past might still be waiting to speak. Thursday morning carried an unusual warmth despite the lingering winter air, and sunlight poured across the streets of Manhattan with the quiet confidence of a season slowly preparing to change. Claire Dawson stepped out of the subway station carrying a portfolio of children's artwork destined for a charity exhibition hosted inside a historic museum overlooking Central Park. The Community Art Center had been invited to display paintings created by students from underserved neighborhoods, and Claire had volunteered to oversee the installation before the evening reception. She arrived early, carefully placing every framed drawing on long wooden tables while volunteers adjusted lights and arranged white display panels throughout the elegant gallery. Bright colors painted by small hands transformed the polished room into something unexpectedly hopeful. Every landscape, every uneven brushstroke reflected simple joy. Claire smiled as she straightened one final frame, unaware that another visitor would soon enter carrying the weight of an entirely different past. Across the city, Damien Ferraro sat inside a climate-controlled archive facility where cardboard evidence boxes lined endless metal shelves beneath fluorescent lights that hummed softly through the silence. An elderly records supervisor carefully lowered a sealed container onto a viewing table before removing brittle tape that had remained untouched for more than 2 decades. "This is the secondary evidence transfer mentioned in the original inventory," he explained. Most people assumed it had been misplaced. Damien nodded without speaking. Inside the box rested damaged clothing, weathered photographs, and several sealed evidence envelopes. One envelope immediately drew the supervisor's attention because someone had written a single sentence across its front in fading blue ink. "Personal note recovered from child's blanket." Damien waited as the protective sleeve was opened with careful precision. A folded piece of paper emerged, yellowed by time and stained along one edge, yet remarkably intact. The handwriting remained legible. "If anything happens to me, please keep this necklace with my daughter. One day she deserves to know why it belonged to her grandmother before it belonged to me. Tell her kindness matters more than fear." The signature beneath the message read only one name, Evelyn. Damien closed his eyes for the briefest moment. 24 years earlier, he had known a young woman named Evelyn who had appeared unexpectedly during the darkest winter of his childhood. She had offered warmth when strangers looked away. She had worn the compass necklace every single day, until the accident. He had believed she died carrying it forever. Now the letter revealed a truth that changed everything. The necklace had never been intended for Evelyn herself. It had always been meant for her daughter. Unfortunately for Claire, she still knew nothing about the promise written on that fragile page. That afternoon, the museum gradually filled with visitors admiring the children's artwork, while soft piano music drifted through the gallery beneath high vaulted ceilings. Parents posed for photographs beside colorful paintings, volunteers served coffee near the entrance, and local donors quietly discussed future education programs. Claire moved through the room helping nervous young artists explain their work to curious guests. She never noticed Damien entering through a side entrance accompanied by only one discreet associate instead of his usual security detail. He had accepted the museum director's invitation to support the education fundraiser long before discovering Claire's connection to the necklace. Fate had quietly arranged the meeting long before either of them realized it. Claire turned while carrying a tray of printed program booklets and stopped in surprise as Damien approached. Recognition softened her expression almost immediately. "I did not expect to see you again," she admitted with a polite smile. Damien glanced around the gallery before answering. "Neither did I." His voice remained calm, but there was something different beneath the restraint she remembered from the airport. Gratitude had quietly replaced distance. He looked toward the paintings covering the walls. "These children are fortunate to have someone who believes in them." Claire laughed softly. "They believe in themselves. I only hand them the paint." Damien studied one bright landscape showing a snowy park filled with families flying colorful kites. Sometimes that is the harder gift. Their conversation lasted only a few minutes, yet it carried an unexpected ease that surprised them both. There was no mention of the necklace, no mention of the airport, only ordinary observations exchanged between two strangers whose lives had already begun quietly intersecting. Then an elderly museum patron wandered toward one of the displays, paused beside Claire, and looked at her with puzzled recognition. "Forgive me," the woman said gently, "but years ago I knew someone who looked remarkably like you." Claire smiled politely. "People have said that before." The woman nodded slowly while studying Claire's face one final time. Her name was Evelyn. Time seemed to pause. Claire had never heard her mother's first name spoken by a complete stranger before. Damien remained perfectly still, his attention fixed on the elderly woman without revealing what the name meant to him. Claire felt an unfamiliar chill despite the warmth inside the gallery. "You knew my mother?" she asked quietly. The woman looked surprised. "Your mother?" Before she could answer, another guest called her name from across the room, pulling her away with an apologetic smile and a promise to return in just a moment. Claire watched the woman disappear into the crowd while questions she had never considered suddenly crowded her thoughts. Damien looked toward the opposite end of the gallery where sunlight spilled across rows of children's paintings, knowing the first true door into the past had finally opened and neither of them would ever be able to close it again. The museum remained filled with quiet conversation long after the elderly woman disappeared into the crowd, yet for Claire Dawson every familiar sound suddenly felt distant, as though the room itself had stepped several feet away. She stood beside the children's paintings, still holding a stack of exhibition brochures she no longer remembered picking up. One name continued echoing through her thoughts: Evelyn. Her mother's name had rarely been spoken outside family gatherings, and certainly never by a complete stranger. Claire looked toward the hallway where the woman had vanished, hoping she would return within seconds. Instead, more guests drifted between the displays, blocking every clear line of sight. Damien Ferraro noticed the uncertainty in Claire's expression, but remained exactly where he stood. He understood better than anyone how dangerous unfinished answers could become when pursued too quickly. "Would you like me to help find her?" he asked quietly. Claire turned toward him, visibly relieved simply because someone else had witnessed the conversation. "If it is not too much trouble." Damien gave a slight nod before speaking softly into a wireless earpiece. His request was calm and respectful. He did not ask anyone to stop the woman or question her. He simply requested that museum staff see whether she was still inside the building. Several minutes passed while Claire greeted visitors and answered questions about the children's artwork, though her attention drifted repeatedly toward every doorway. Unfortunately for her, the elderly guest had already left through a side entrance after receiving an urgent phone call from a family member. By the time staff checked the security desk, she was gone. The disappointment settled quietly across Claire's face, though she quickly apologized for allowing a personal matter to interrupt the event. Damien shook his head gently. "Some conversations arrive before we are ready for them." Claire looked at him with quiet curiosity. "You sound as though you have experienced that yourself." He held her gaze for a brief moment before answering. More than once, neither of them said anything else. The silence between them felt unexpectedly comfortable rather than awkward, filled by the soft notes of a piano drifting through the gallery. As the afternoon continued, visitors slowly gathered near the stage, where several children prepared to describe their paintings. Claire remained close to the young artists, offering reassuring smiles whenever nervous hands tightened around prepared speeches. Damien watched from the back of the room. He noticed how every anxious child looked toward Claire before stepping forward. She never interrupted. She never spoke for them. She simply reminded them with a nod that they were capable on their own. It was a quiet form of leadership that required no recognition. When the final presentation ended, generous applause echoed beneath the museum's high ceilings. The director announced that the fundraiser had exceeded every financial goal, ensuring another full year of arts education for hundreds of children. Claire smiled with genuine happiness while the students celebrated around her. She never sought the spotlight even after several parents thanked her personally for changing their children's confidence. Damien quietly approached the museum director before leaving. "Please keep my contribution anonymous," he requested. Most donors appreciate recognition. Damien glanced toward Claire, laughing with the children across the room. The purpose is the work, not the name attached to it. As evening settled over Central Park, the reception gradually came to an end. Volunteers folded tables, removed decorations, and packed artwork for transport back to the community center. Claire carried several framed paintings toward the loading area behind the museum, where crisp winter air replaced the warmth of the crowded gallery. She paused beside the stone steps overlooking the park, taking a deep breath while snowflakes began drifting gently through the fading light. Damien stepped outside a few moments later, stopping several feet away to avoid intruding. "May I ask you something?" he said. Claire nodded. "Of course," he chose his words carefully. "How much do you know about your mother's life before you were born?" The question caught her completely off guard. She looked toward the park before answering honestly. "Very little. She died when I was young. My grandmother told me she preferred looking forward instead of talking about painful memories." Damien remained silent for several seconds. He had promised himself he would not reveal unfinished truths, supported only by fragments and coincidence. "Sometimes the past waits until the right person is ready to hear it," he said at last. Claire studied him with growing curiosity. "Do you know something about her?" Before he could answer, his phone vibrated quietly. He glanced at the screen only long enough to read one message from the archivist. "Positive identification confirmed. Additional family records located." Damien slowly lowered the phone, realizing the investigation had crossed from possibility into certainty. Yet the documents had not reached his hands. He still refused to speak before seeing every page himself. Claire noticed the subtle change in his expression but respected the silence. "Whatever it is," she said gently, "I hope you find the answers you are looking for." Damien almost smiled. "I believe they may have already found me." Claire watched him walk toward the waiting car beneath the museum lights, unaware that inside a secure archive across the city, a newly discovered file now carried two names side by side for the first time in 24 years. And by morning, the hidden connection between Evelyn and Claire would no longer exist only as a question. Friday morning arrived beneath a brilliant blue sky that made the previous week's snow seem like a distant memory. Claire Dawson unlocked the community arts center with the same quiet routine she had followed for years, yet nothing inside her felt entirely familiar anymore. The conversation at the museum lingered in her thoughts long after she had returned home. A stranger had recognized her mother's name. Damien Ferraro had asked questions no one else had ever asked, and somewhere between those two moments the past had stopped feeling like a closed chapter. She placed her bag beside her desk and reached for the old leather journal she had borrowed from her grandmother the night before. Its worn cover creaked softly as she untied the faded ribbon. Inside, careful handwriting filled the yellowed pages with recipes, shopping lists, small sketches, and scattered memories during ordinary days that no one could have known would become precious decades later. Claire smiled while reading simple entries about rainy afternoons, homemade soup, and bedtime stories. Then one sentence made her stop turning pages. "Sometimes the compass reminds me that every lost road still leads somewhere." Her fingertips rested gently against the ink. The word compass stirred something she could not explain. She had seen that shape before. Unfortunately for Claire, the answer was already crossing Manhattan inside a sealed courier envelope addressed to Damien Ferraro. He waited alone inside his office as the package arrived shortly after 9 o'clock. The archivist had personally delivered rather than trusting ordinary mail. Damien opened the envelope carefully. A certified birth record rested on top. Claire Dawson, mother. Evelyn Dawson, father. Unknown. Beneath it lay another document recovered from an adoption agency that had quietly assisted with the transfer after the highway accident. Attached was a faded photograph that had never appeared in any public archive. Damien stared at it without moving. Evelyn stood beneath autumn trees holding the hand of a smiling little girl no older than 3. Around Evelyn's neck hung the familiar compass necklace. Around the child's wrist was a tiny woven bracelet made from blue thread. Damien slowly reached into the wooden keepsake box inside his safe. Hidden beneath the newspaper clipping rested that exact bracelet, carefully preserved for 24 years. He remembered the frightened little child who had handed it to him moments before strangers separated them during the confusion following the accident. He had never known her name. He had never known whether she survived. The documents answered both questions with quiet certainty. Claire had never been someone who merely resembled the past. She had always been part of it. Damien closed the file and leaned back in silence, relief mixed with grief in ways he had not expected. He had searched for answers believing they would finally erase old regrets. Instead, they made every memory feel vividly alive again. Across Queens, Claire continued reading the journal while waiting for the children to arrive. One page slipped free from the binding and drifted onto the desk. Folded inside was a pressed maple leaf wrapped around a small handwritten note. If Claire ever asks about the necklace, tell her only when she is ready to carry the story instead of the sorrow. Claire frowned gently. She had never heard anyone mention a necklace before. She turned the paper over, hoping another explanation waited on the back. There was only a date written neatly in one corner. It matched the week before the highway accident that had taken her mother's life. Before Claire could think further, children burst through the classroom door, laughing excitedly about the weekend. She carefully tucked the note inside the journal, promising herself she would ask her grandmother that evening. At that exact moment, Damien stood before the panoramic windows overlooking the East River with the recovered photograph in one hand and the silver compass necklace in the other. Every document now confirmed the same truth. Evelyn had intended the necklace for Claire. Fate, coincidence, or something far more mysterious had allowed it to return to the daughter after 24 years. Yet one question still remained unanswered. Why had the necklace appeared beneath an airport seat on the exact day Claire crossed paths with him? No record explained that final mystery. His assistant entered quietly. "Sir, should we contact Miss Dawson now?" Damien looked once more at the photograph before answering. "Not until I can tell her the whole truth. And if she refuses to believe it?" the assistant asked. Damien's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Then I will give her every reason to decide for herself." Across the city, Claire closed the journal as children gathered around fresh canvases waiting for another lesson. She smiled warmly and handed out paintbrushes one by one, never realizing that the story her mother had tried so carefully to protect was finally making its way back to her, carried not by chance alone but by a promise written decades earlier that had survived time, distance, and silence. The city seemed unusually quiet that evening, as though New York itself had paused between one heartbeat and the next. Claire Dawson left the Community Arts Center carrying the leather journal beneath one arm, her thoughts returning again and again to the unfinished sentence her mother had left behind. "If Claire ever asks about the necklace, tell her only when she is ready to carry the story instead of the sorrow." The words followed her through crowded sidewalks, onto the subway, and all the way to her grandmother's small house where warm lights glowed behind familiar curtains. Dinner had already been prepared, filling the kitchen with the comforting aroma of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and rosemary. For a little while, ordinary conversation returned. They talked about neighborhood friends, the children's upcoming art exhibition, and the unusually mild weather expected the following week. Claire almost convinced herself she could postpone the questions another day. Yet every glance toward the journal resting beside her chair reminded her that silence no longer felt like kindness. After clearing the dishes together, she gently placed the journal on the dining table. Her grandmother looked at it before looking back at Claire. No explanation was necessary. She had been expecting this conversation for years. Claire spoke softly. "Who was the necklace for?" The older woman closed her eyes for a brief moment before answering. "I always hoped you would ask when you were ready instead of when you were angry." She reached for the journal and carefully opened it to the page containing the folded note. Your mother believed every family carries one story that cannot be forced. It has to find its own time. Claire remained silent, allowing the room to settle around them. Rain began tapping lightly against the kitchen window, replacing the cheerful sounds of the afternoon with quiet reflection. The necklace belonged to your great-grandmother first, her grandmother continued. She gave it to Evelyn on the day you were born. She told her it was never valuable because of the silver. It mattered because every woman in your family had worn it while choosing kindness over fear during difficult moments. Claire listened without interrupting. Then why did nobody ever tell me? The answer arrived slowly. Because after the accident, the necklace disappeared. We believed it had been lost forever. Losing it was painful, but losing your mother mattered far more. Eventually we stopped talking about it because every conversation reopened wounds that never truly healed. Claire lowered her eyes toward the journal. The mystery had grown larger instead of smaller. She remembered the necklace she had returned at the airport with sudden clarity, every engraved detail, every worn edge polished by decades of careful hands. "Grandma," she whispered, "I think I found it." The older woman's expression froze. For several long seconds she simply stared at Claire without speaking. "What did you say?" Claire explained everything from the beginning, the airport, the forgotten necklace beneath the seat, the businessman who had claimed it, the unexpected donation to the art center, the museum, the woman who recognized Evelyn's name. Every moment flowed together until the kitchen fell completely silent. Her grandmother's hands trembled ever so slightly as tears gathered in her eyes. "After all these years," she whispered, "I never believed it would come back." At that exact moment, several miles away, Damien Ferraro stood inside a quiet chapel tucked between two historic buildings in Lower Manhattan. Few people knew he visited the small sanctuary every year on the anniversary of the winter accident. He carried no flowers this time. Only the compass necklace resting inside a velvet box. Sunlight from stained glass windows painted soft colors across the wooden pews, while the building remained otherwise empty. Damien placed the box gently on the front bench before sitting alone in silence. He remembered Evelyn's laughter. He remembered the warmth she had shown a frightened boy long before either of them understood how quickly life could change. Most of all, he remembered the promise he had made to himself after the accident. If the necklace was ever found, it would return to the family it belonged to. That promise no longer felt impossible. His phone vibrated quietly. It was a message from his assistant confirming that every historical record had now been independently verified by legal investigators. There was no remaining doubt. Claire Dawson was Evelyn's daughter. Damien read the message only once before locking the screen. He did not feel triumph, only gratitude mixed with responsibility. Across the city, Claire and her grandmother remained seated at the kitchen table long after the tea had grown cold. "Do you remember the man's name?" her grandmother finally asked. Claire nodded slowly. "Damien Ferraro." Surprise crossed the older woman's face, followed almost immediately by recognition that had survived 24 years. She looked toward the rain-covered window before speaking in little more than a whisper. "Then perhaps the necklace never truly lost its way. Perhaps it was simply waiting for both of you to be ready." Outside, the rain washed winter salt from quiet streets while two separate promises, made decades apart by two very different people, began moving toward the same inevitable destination. Sunday morning unfolded beneath a sky so clear that every building reflected pale winter sunlight like polished glass. Claire Dawson stood outside the small neighborhood church where her grandmother attended every week, watching families greet one another with easy smiles before slowly making their way home. The conversation from the previous evening had changed something inside her. Questions she had quietly accepted for years no longer felt distant, they felt personal. She slipped her hands into her coat pockets as a cool breeze carried the scent of evergreen and fresh coffee from a nearby bakery. Her grandmother joined her on the sidewalk, gently linking her arm through Claire's. Neither of them hurried to speak. Some truths needed silence before they could become words. "Do you think I should see him?" Claire finally asked. Her grandmother considered the question carefully instead of answering immediately. "I think you should see the truth," she replied. "Whether that includes him is something only you can decide." Claire nodded slowly. She appreciated that no one was trying to choose for her. Across Manhattan, Damien Ferraro stood inside his office overlooking the East River with the recovered necklace resting in its velvet box beside the family records. Every document had now been authenticated. Every date matched. Every unanswered question surrounding Claire's identity had finally been resolved. Only one responsibility remained. He needed to place the necklace where it had always belonged and tell Claire everything without expecting anything in return. His assistant entered carrying a single envelope. "The letter from Evelyn has been professionally preserved," she said. "The archivist recommend limiting direct handling." Damien accepted the protective case with quiet gratitude. The faded handwriting seemed even more fragile beneath archival glass, yet the message remained unmistakably clear. Kindness matters more than fear. He read those words once more before closing the case. They no longer felt like advice from the past. They felt like instructions for the conversation still waiting ahead. By early afternoon, Claire returned to the Community Arts Center to prepare for the coming week's classes. The building remained empty except for soft instrumental music drifting through the speakers while sunlight stretched across rows of drying paintings. She welcomed the peaceful silence. As she organized brushes and fresh canvases, her phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. For a brief moment she considered ignoring it. Instead she answered. "Miss Dawson?" a calm voice asked. "My name is Margaret. I work for Mr. Ferraro. He asked whether you would be willing to meet him at a public place of your choosing. There is information concerning your mother that he believes belongs to you." Claire closed her eyes briefly. She'd expected this call from the moment her grandmother recognized Damien's name. "Will I be pressured into anything?" she asked honestly. "Absolutely not," Margaret answered without hesitation. "If you decline, Mr. Ferraro will respect your decision completely." Claire looked across the empty classroom, where dozens of children's paintings brightened the walls. Every drawing reminded her that courage rarely arrived without uncertainty. "Tomorrow afternoon," she replied. "The Botanical Garden Conservatory in Brooklyn. It is open and public. Thank you, Miss Dawson. We will be there." The call ended. Claire remained standing quietly for several moments before returning to her work with slower, more thoughtful movements. At that exact moment, Damien received confirmation of the meeting. Relief crossed his face, though only briefly. This was not the beginning of a victory. It was the beginning of a promise finally being honored. The following afternoon arrived wrapped in gentle sunshine that filtered through the glass roof of the conservatory, filling the air with warmth despite the winter season outside. Tropical plants surrounded winding stone paths while fountains echoed softly beneath towering palms. Families wandered between blooming orchids, children pointed excitedly at colorful butterflies, and quiet conversation blended naturally into the peaceful atmosphere. Claire arrived first, choosing a wooden bench overlooking a small indoor pond where koi fish moved lazily beneath floating lily pads. She wore the same simple navy coat she had worn at the airport weeks earlier. Nothing about her appearance suggested she expected life to change within the next hour. Damien entered several minutes later, carrying only a slim leather folder and the small velvet box. No security followed him inside. No assistants interrupted the moment. He stopped several feet away, allowing Claire every opportunity to leave if she wished. She remained seated, meeting his eyes with calm curiosity rather than fear. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. Claire offered a polite nod. "You told me the past waits until someone is ready. I think I am ready to listen." Damien sat across from her instead of beside her, placing the leather folder on the table between them without opening it. "Everything I am about to tell you can be supported by records, photographs and letters," he began. "If at any point you want to stop, we stop." Claire appreciated the certainty in his voice. There were no dramatic promises, no impossible claims, only respect. Damien gently opened the folder, revealing the preserved photograph of Evelyn holding the hand of a little girl beneath autumn trees. Claire reached toward the image almost instinctively, her fingertips trembling ever so slightly as she recognized her mother's smile. Then Damien slowly placed the velvet box beside the photograph and lifted the lid. The silver compass necklace reflected warm sunlight filtering through the conservatory glass, and for the first time since the airport, Claire understood that the object she had returned had never truly belonged to the stranger sitting across from her. It had been finding its way home all along. Claire Dawson looked at the silver compass necklace resting inside the velvet box for a long moment before reaching toward it with careful hands. She did not touch it immediately. Instead, her attention drifted to the photograph lying beside it. The little girl smiling beside Evelyn wore a blue woven bracelet around her wrist. Claire recognized it instantly. Her grandmother had kept that bracelet inside an old memory box for years, telling everyone it was simply one of the few childhood keepsakes that had survived the accident. Damien Ferraro noticed the recognition in her expression before quietly sliding another document across the small wooden table between them. It was the preserved letter written in Evelyn's unmistakable handwriting. Claire unfolded the archival copy with extraordinary care, almost afraid the paper might disappear if she breathed too quickly. The familiar handwriting carried a warmth she had not realized she missed until that moment. "If anything happens to me, please keep this necklace with my daughter. One day she deserves to know why it belonged to her grandmother before it belonged to me. Tell her kindness matters more than fear." Claire read the sentence twice before lowering the page. Tears gathered slowly in her eyes, though her voice remained steady. "She wrote this for me." Damien nodded gently. "She did." Neither of them hurried to fill the silence. Around them, visitors continued wandering beneath towering palms. Children laughed somewhere beyond the tropical garden, and water flowed quietly over smooth stones inside the conservatory fountain. Life continued with remarkable normality, while one family's unfinished story quietly reached its final chapter. Claire finally looked toward Damien. "My grandmother said she believed the necklace was lost forever." Damien rested his hands lightly against the table. "So did I." He spoke without embellishment, allowing the truth to remain simple. "Your mother helped me many years ago when I was a frightened boy trying to make sense of a world that suddenly felt much larger than I understood. She never asked who I was. She never expected anything in return. She simply chose kindness." Claire listened carefully, noticing that he never tried to make himself the center of the story. Every sentence returned to Evelyn instead. "After the accident," Damien continued quietly, "I believed she had died with the necklace. When investigators separated us, nobody knew who the little girl beside her was. By the time I searched years later, every official record had disappeared into different agencies. I spent decades believing I had failed to keep the one promise I never spoke aloud." Claire lowered her eyes toward the silver pendant reflecting warm afternoon sunlight. "You promised yourself you would return it." Damien smiled faintly. "Yes." Claire carefully lifted the necklace from the velvet lining. The silver felt unexpectedly warm, despite resting untouched inside the box. She studied the worn compass rose before turning it over. Tiny initials were engraved inside the back, exactly where her fingers naturally settled. E.D. Evelyn Dawson. For the first time in her life, the necklace was no longer an abstract family story. It was real. It had survived everything her family had not. Claire fastened it around her neck with slow, deliberate movements. The pendant rested lightly against her heart, as though it had always belonged there. Damien watched without saying a word. The moment required no explanation. After several quiet seconds, Claire looked back toward him. "Thank you for protecting something that belonged to my family." Damien shook his head gently. "I only carried it until it found its rightful place." The answer settled something inside Claire that had remained uncertain ever since the airport. She realized he had never tried to possess the necklace, the mystery, or even the conversation itself. Every decision he had made had been guided by respect rather than obligation. "There is one question I still do not understand," she admitted. "How did the necklace end up beneath that airport seat after all these years?" Damien reached into the folder and removed one final document. It was a property inventory from a private estate recently donated to a historical foundation. "Several months ago, an elderly collector passed away," he explained. His family donated hundreds of personal belongings that had been stored for decades. The necklace had apparently been purchased years earlier at an estate sale without anyone recognizing its history. During transportation between collections, one volunteer unknowingly placed it inside a carry-on bag. It slipped beneath the airport seat before anyone realized it was missing. Claire looked at the document before quietly laughing through tears. After everything, it came back because someone accidentally dropped a bag. Damien's smile grew just enough to soften the years visible around his eyes. "Sometimes extraordinary journeys end through very ordinary moments." Claire nodded. She understood now why her mother had written that kindness mattered more than fear. A single honest decision made at an airport had reunited a family story scattered across 24 years. As late afternoon sunlight poured through the conservatory glass, painting golden reflections across the pond beside them, neither Claire nor Damien felt the need to chase any more unanswered questions. The mystery that had shaped both their lives was finally complete, leaving behind not the weight of unfinished grief, but the quiet certainty that some promises simply wait until the right people are ready to keep them. Spring arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, replacing the last traces of winter with flowering trees. and sunlight that lingered across New York long after office lights began glowing inside the skyline. Weeks passed without urgency. Claire Dawson returned to the rhythm she loved most, filling classrooms with paint, laughter, and children who believed blank paper could become anything. The silver compass necklace rested gently against her collarbone every day, hidden beneath simple sweaters or scarves, no longer because it needed protection, but because it had become part of her life instead of a mystery waiting to be solved. The questions that had once followed her everywhere had finally found their answers, leaving space for something entirely new. Peace. Damien Ferraro also returned to familiar routines, although those who worked beside him quietly noticed subtle changes that no business report could explain. He no longer cancelled charitable education meetings. He visited the community arts center anonymously more than once, never entering the classrooms while lessons were taking place, simply ensuring future programs remained funded without attaching his name to any announcement. He understood now that the greatest promises were often the ones fulfilled without applause. Claire eventually discovered where the unexpected support had come from, not because Damien admitted it, but because the center's director accidentally mentioned a generous benefactor who insisted every scholarship remain anonymous. She smiled to herself when she heard the description. Some people protected others through loud gestures. Damien seemed determined to do it quietly. One warm Saturday afternoon, Claire invited her grandmother to the annual Student Art Festival, held inside a renovated warehouse overlooking the East River. Hundreds of paintings lined brick walls beneath strings of soft lights while families wandered between exhibits created by children from neighborhoods across the city. Every corner overflowed with color, hope, and imagination. Near the center of the gallery stood one final installation prepared entirely by Claire's students. It showed a long winding road stretching toward the horizon beneath a bright sky. At the center of the painting hung a simple silver compass surrounded by blooming wildflowers. A handwritten title beneath the artwork read, "Kindness always finds its way home." Visitors paused before the painting longer than any other display. Some admired the colors, others admired the message. Only 3 people understood how deeply those words reached into the past. Damien arrived later that afternoon carrying no entourage, wearing an ordinary navy jacket instead of a tailored overcoat, blending naturally into the families exploring the exhibition. Claire noticed him from across the room and walked over with an easy smile that no longer carried uncertainty. There was no mystery standing between them anymore. Only shared memories and quiet understanding. "You made it," she said warmly. "I promised I would support the children," Damien replied. "Besides, I was curious to see what they created." Claire guided him toward the compass painting without explaining why. He stopped in front of it and remained silent for several moments. The painted compass looked remarkably similar to the necklace resting beneath Claire's blouse, yet the surrounding flowers transformed it into something entirely different. No longer an object connected to grief, it had become a symbol of hope. "They asked me what helps people find their way," Claire explained softly. "I told them kindness usually gets there first." Damien looked toward her with quiet gratitude. "Your mother would have agreed." Claire nodded. "I think she already did." They stood together watching children excitedly explain their artwork to proud parents while sunlight reflected across the river outside the warehouse windows. Nothing about the afternoon felt extraordinary to anyone else. There were no dramatic revelations left to uncover, no hidden enemies waiting beyond the next corner, no unfinished mysteries demanding another chapter. Life had finally become exactly what both of them had spent years searching for: honest, peaceful, whole. As evening approached, Claire's grandmother joined them carrying a small wrapped package. She handed it to Claire with a smile. Inside rested the tiny blue woven bracelet that had survived every move, every season, and every unanswered question. "It belongs with the rest of your story now," she said gently. Claire slipped the bracelet around her wrist beside the necklace resting over her heart. Past and present no longer felt separated. They belonged together. Later, after the festival ended, Claire and Damien found themselves walking through the airport terminal where everything had quietly begun months before. They had come only to welcome a group of children flying home after winning a national youth art competition. Travelers hurried toward departure gates. Rolling suitcases echoed across polished floors. and afternoon sunlight poured through the enormous glass windows overlooking departing airplanes. Claire paused beside the same seating area where she had once discovered a forgotten necklace beneath an empty chair. She smiled at the memory before turning toward the windows. An airplane lifted gracefully into the evening sky, climbing higher with effortless certainty. Damien stood beside her without speaking. There was nothing left that required words. The necklace was no longer lost. The promise had been kept. The family story had finally returned to the daughter for whom it had always been written. Together they watched another aircraft disappear beyond the clouds, not wondering where the journey would lead, because for the first time in many years, both of them already knew they had arrived exactly where they belonged.